So hello, everyone. As people continue to join in, really glad to have people today for this installment of Welcome Change, which is, again, Ashoka's conversation series about what's working and about what's next. I'm excited to be joined by Ashoka fellow Cristi Hegranes today, journalist and social entrepreneur and founder of Global Press, and of course, author of a new book, Byline, which we will talk about today. I remember meeting Cristi for the first time more than a decade ago now, when she was still bootstrapping and working out of a tiny donated office space in San Francisco. And to get to your desk, Cristi, you had to walk past someone who had to stand up and get out of their chair. Otherwise, you couldn't get past. So just
that is correct.
remind people, this is often where things begin for social entrepreneurs before they publish their books years later. So I'm Michael Zakaris. For those of you who don't know me by now, I'm director of Ashoka in the US. And as is the typical format, I'll speak with Cristi for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll turn it to those listening in to submit some of their own questions. So welcome, Cristi. It's so good to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I read your book last weekend, thoroughly enjoyed it, and recommend it to anyone interested not just in journalism, but in better understanding where and how we get our information about the world and how that shapes our minds and our beliefs. So I'll just jump right in with some questions. One of the things that you're highlighting in the book, and of course also demonstrating via Global Press, is an alternative to what you refer to as parachute journalism. So I'd like you to just tell us briefly what that is.
Yeah, it's a great place to start. I think oftentimes we all kind of like lament the demise of journalism, but don't actually really understand like how the pieces have fit together. And starting in the 90s, major legacy news organizations started closing foreign bureaus. And in the last 30 years, about 80+% of foreign bureaus have closed. So this gave rise to the discipline of parachute journalism, which is instead of having a bureau-based correspondent in a location for a long period of time, instead news organizations now drop people into global communities for usually just a few days, and crucially, typically in times of crisis. So the elimination of foreign bureaus has really perpetuated a very narrow, stereotypical, and problematic worldview, where today the vast majority of international news centers on just 4 topics: war, poverty, disaster, disease. So the global press model really exists to not just combat those narratives, but really offer a viable path forward for international coverage in the future.
And so your alternative, right, of course, which we'll hear about, centers local journalists. And you say in the book that when the who of the reporter changes, we get different stories, we get better stories. Ultimately, we get a better understanding of our world and of each other. And so I'd love for you, because this, one of the fun things about the book is it's rich with all these different specific examples and stories that you've seen and that have been reported over the last decade plus through Global Press. So can you share a quick specific story that illustrates the difference between what you get with parachute journalism versus what you get in your model?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, I had to mute myself for some mild toddler chaos in the background. Yeah, so, I think, like I was saying, war, poverty, disaster, disease, right? And so there's a great disaster example that I talk about in the book, and that is in 2021, Mount Nyiragongo erupted in Goma, in Democratic Republic of Congo. And as is, typical, images of, the volcano and, people, fleeing, etc., was on international news for like 2 days. After that, the story kind of, fades and we all just forget that it happened and we move on to the next like crisis or disaster somewhere else. Well, Global Press senior reporter Noella Nyirabihogo, who has been with us since 2012 and is an exceptional reporter, she really embodies the Global Press definition of news value, which is a subtle shift, but rather than doing action-based coverage, Global Press focuses on consequence-based coverage. So yes, Noella was out in the streets doing interviews and taking photos the day the volcano erupted, but she actually published her story 3 months later. And her story was about why the volcanic warning system didn't go off. right? So there is a volcanic observatory in Goma that monitors Mount Nyiragongo, and it is largely funded by international and multinational agencies and institutions. Turns out that at the time of the volcanic eruption, uh, the observatory was so underfunded that they didn't even have an internet connection. And so through Noella's reporting, she was able to discover that that international funding was being routed through the central government in DRC, and the money just wasn't reaching the observatory due to corruption and other problems. So her story was not just deeply important to remind audiences like, hey, this thing happened, like you still care about this, but also because a local journalist is uniquely capable of holding power to account over time, right? They're not just popping in and then popping out. She stayed and spent 3 months figuring out like, why didn't this warning system go off? And the result of her coverage was, one, that funding was rerouted. And today, does the observatory have internet? Like, yes, it absolutely does. And so I think it just really speaks to the power of consequence driven reporting versus action driven, and just the unique proximity and access that local journalists have to tell stories that are deeply important, not just to local people who deserve that accurate information, but also to international readers who also have a stake in these stories.
Yeah, that's a great example. I remember, and it's one of the examples in the book. And so you mentioned proximity. Obviously, that's a big emphasis here. It's at the center of Global Press's model, and of course, it's an emphasis of Ashoka's too. Yeah, and has been for more than 40 years. When that was pretty unconventional, in the early 80s, investing in local talent. So it's about proximity, but it's also really about agency too, right? About asset framing, about local talent. Tell us more about that and why that's important.
Yeah, so Global Press has a very unique model where we don't just train and employ local journalists, we train and employ local women journalists. And there's a very specific reason why. There is an evidence-based correlation between who works in a newsroom and who is quoted and featured in stories. So when we think about representation in the media, we actually have to rewind that back even further, and we have to think about representation in the newsroom. Who are the people that are actually tasked with telling these stories? Now, it is not a coincidence that 2/3 of international news is reported by men, and women make up less than 25% of news sources in international stories. And when they do, they tend to be sort of the, victim-based narrative, someone in like shabby clothing experiencing a horrible thing in the lead. And then you sort of pivot to like, here are the real experts that can tell you how to fix her problem type of storytelling. So at Global Press, we have two really crucial policies in our news gathering. One is a non-assignment policy. That means me sitting here in Washington, D.C. in almost 18 years, I've never made an assignment. We trust our reporters to level up the stories that are the most important to tell. Second, we have a local sourcing policy. That means that the experts that you read, the data that you see in our stories, they are locally driven. And this is such a seemingly small detail, but it's so deeply important. So take Haiti, for example. Haiti is a place that international media covers almost solely as just like a sort of like wretched disaster, like, disaster infused place. What you see so often is the sources and stories tend to be from American or Canadian NGOs or international agencies like the UN. And the subtle message that that sends to readers is Haitians have no agency. Haitians are not educated. Haitians are not capable of solving their own problems, which is, of course, deeply inaccurate. So if you read a Global Press story, not only will you get a really nuanced, consequence-driven news angle, you will also hear from entirely local sources who don't just have credentialed expertise, they also have lived experience. So really, we really think deeply about not just who's telling our stories, but then we think critically about who we invite into our stories to tell and to further these narratives. And that is the root of narrative change, right? That is how we will all be able to begin to understand the world and our places in it differently when we really focus on who tells our stories and how we can tell them differently.
And you write about how how the status quo creates this distorted sense of reality, right? Whether it's about Haiti or anywhere else. You also quote Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who says that power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person, right? Which is, as always, beautiful and articulate. This is about more than just journalism, then.
Absolutely. I think especially in today's media environment, like we have to think about story more holistically, right? It's more than just a print piece of journalism or a television broadcast. We're thinking about we're thinking about social, we're thinking about radio, TV, we're thinking about billboards on the sides of streets, we're thinking about how people consume information, and really like who is the storyteller of record. And it's important for so many reasons, but we are of course living through a moment where trust in journalism, trust in media has never been lower. And one of the very simple reasons that trust is so fractured in journalism is because just plainly, people often don't recognize themselves in stories. So if there's a story about your community, you read it and you're like, nope, that doesn't reflect my experience. It becomes really easy to begin to buy narratives of fake news, mis and disinformation. So one of the easiest things we can do to begin to repair the trust with our readers is to give them proximate storytellers who have the social, historical, political, linguistic access to tell stories over time, so that we're not just getting, that one column twice a year about Haiti, and that becomes the definitive narrative of Haiti. And not only does it not allow for dignified representation of the people of Haiti, it doesn't allow for people to have a comprehensive understanding of what is happening there. And it also doesn't allow people to understand the interconnectedness of our world and how and why stories from Mongolia or Haiti or Congo matter to all of us.
Now, part of the pushback from journalists in the industry is something to the effect of, we're just giving people what they want, right? These are the stories they read. This is what they click on. We have the data. But you're writing and saying that what consumers are demanding is changing.
It's one of my favorite and least favorite parts of the book is I spoke to so many journalists, so many former foreign correspondents, many of whom were, really powerfully transparent about, their former practice. But I also spoke to a lot of newsroom leaders and publishers that were like, yeah. People don't actually care about international news. It's low click rates. The cover of Newsweek that's international always sells the fewest copies. Like people don't really care. Well, Global Press and others have been investing in audience research that actually tells quite a different story. Data now tells us that it's not so much that readers don't care about the world, it's that they don't care for the way the world stories are being told. People are fatigued by disaster and victim-centered narratives. And what we found in Global Press did a 10-month audience research project with focus groups, nationwide surveys in the US. And we found that nearly 2/3 of US-based news readers prefer to read news from local journalists rather than foreign correspondents. And people had really powerful reasons for this, right? They were like, hey, look, what I'm getting from this guy, I could get anywhere. These local journalists are giving me like depth and nuance and context, and they're actually helping me to understand the world better. And an AP NORC survey from last year found that what Gen Z and millennial newsreaders want most is the ability to understand communities outside of their own. That's what they want from the news. So I think this is a real moment for all of us to just really push back on legacy media and say, like, look, I understand that that is what maybe used to be true, but even if publishers aren't ready for this shift, audiences are. I've been doing this for a long time, 17 plus years now, and I have never seen audiences more activated, and I have never seen people care more deeply about who tells the story.
Mm. And you're just launching a tour, started yesterday, across the US promoting the book, and you told us last week that the book is a celebration of local, wherever your local is, right? Which I love. And obviously local journalism is so critical for so many things, also including democracy. And yet both local journalism and democracy have been under threat, for some time. So how do we reverse that? And what can we learn from Global Press that might apply to this country?
Yeah, I think a lot, right? And one of the things I'm most excited about the Byline book tour, is one, that we're having one at all, and two, that I have really used this opportunity to highlight local news, particularly not nonprofit news organizations across the country. In that same audience research I was talking about, we learned that less than 4% of people in the US know or understand what nonprofit news is. And in more and more places across the US, nonprofit news it's the investigation, it's the representative newsrooms, it's the really holistic, powerful storytelling. So in every city where I am over the course of the next couple of months, I will be in conversation with newsroom leaders from places like New Mexico in Depth in Santa Fe, or Prison Journalism Project, or Capital B, the 19th, so many like really exceptional news organizations. And I think, even last week, the announcement of Press Forward, right, a $500 million investment in local news in the US. I think people have a lot of questions like, what does that mean? What does a $500 million investment mean? Where will it go? Why does it matter? And something I often say in philanthropic spaces is like, look, whatever your number one issue is, if it's democracy, if it's climate, if it's gender, you gotta make independent journalism your number two, because the ability to reach audiences with high quality, ethical, accurate information is the only way that we can really move the needle on so many of these different issues. So I'm really excited about the emphasis on local in the US, and I think that if we can get legacy media to follow suit, to really value proximity and access and local reporting, I think we have the opportunity in a very short period of time to completely change the storytellers of record, which will, give hundreds of millions of people a better and fuller understanding of the world.
And that's fascinating that 4% nonprofit journalism, because my next question was going to be like, how much does the fact that journalism is set up as a for-profit business complicate things? And I can't, it seems to run counter, right, to the fundamental role that we know journalism plays in our world, and in telling the stories that we need to hear to function as a society. And yet it seems pretty obvious that the stories that may sell are not necessarily the same stories that are going to be most important to tell and to put resources into.
Yeah, it's funny. It's decades now we've been talking about like the business model failure of journalism, right? And so much of what the book is about, particularly the second half of the book, is like, this isn't rocket science, y'all. Like, let's just like break down the problems and let's like fix some really fundamental pieces of our profession, of our craft. And something that I think is really important to focus on is, it is so easy to lament the poor quality of journalism in the world, but we often don't acknowledge the fact that the majority of journalism jobs are actually poor quality employment, right? So the ability to provide strong pay, benefits, duty of care, provide for the safety and security of journalists, whether you're in, Democratic Republic of Congo or Washington, D.C., wherever you are. I think that, a real investment in the storyteller, protecting our truth tellers, and making sure that, we are sustaining our craft by taking care of the people in it. I think that is one absolute key. And I think, readers will respond to that. And, the profession, I think, has a lot to invest in when it comes to their storytellers. If you take online harassment, for example, new data tells us that 70% of women journalists now face extraordinary levels of online harassment, and it's a primary driver of women leaving the field. So these are like existential issues that are also solvable problems. So much of what the book is about is really focused on news readers, journalists, and newsroom leaders to say like, look, hey, we can all solve a piece of this problem to make it not so intractable, so that really ethical, accurate information can permeate our world and really sort of turn some of these very negative tides.
And a question for you that that we are always so curious about with any Ashoka Fellow and any social entrepreneur is sort of, how do you, like, what is giving you confidence now that people are paying attention to this and that you're starting to see the tide turn, right? Because for a long time you're over here saying, hey, the way you're doing it is not working. there's a better way. It's not even necessarily rocket science, and like, look at this
Yeah.
over here. And then, but that's still getting that to start to seep into the drinking water can take time, and it can be hard work,
Yeah.
obviously. And so at this point, are you seeing some signs of that that give you confidence?
Actually, yes. And I think the pandemic had a lot to do with it. I have been sort of beating this drum for a very long time now to say, like, let's rethink parachute journalism. Let's, like, rethink this whole international model. Well, COVID really did that for us, right? Because for 2 years, very few parachute journalists were parachuting anywhere. As a result, both publishers and audiences alike pivoted reliance to local journalists, right? People who were previously just treated as fixers, were all of a sudden elevated to the byline. And so it was one of the reasons that I felt such urgency to get this book out as like immediate post-pandemic as possible, because this is the moment to say, like, no, 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 no. We just started to get it right. Let's not go back to the way we were doing it before. And I think that audiences are so activated. I think that the combination of the pandemic, racial justice movements, environmental justice movements have really seeded in people the ability to question systems and structures of power, particularly those that have historically relegated diverse voices more than they ever have. I remember vividly, like 2008, when Global Press was just like brand new baby Global Press. And I said the sentence, foreign correspondence is a colonial discipline. And I said it in a philanthropic space, and people looked at me like I had lizards crawling out of my eyes. We are now living in a time where you can say foreign correspondence is a colonial discipline, and people can engage with that. People can think about that, and people can engage in solutions and different opportunities. So, I think there is hope, and I think majority of that hope is being led by newsreaders, particularly young newsreaders
Hmm.
who have such intrinsic definitions of justice and equity and real boundaries for right and wrong. So I have a lot of hope in the future of journalism because I have a lot of confidence in young newsreaders.
That's great. And I guess to follow up on that, as readers, as consumers of the news who may be frustrated or who may occasionally see the kind of piece that we think is like, yes, this is what I want more of, what can we actually do, like, specifically to help promote, the right kind of journalism, to help people see that, hey, more of this, please.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things I really tried to do in the book is kind of open the black box of like journalism and how it operates, because I think people often don't know. But the reality is that almost because journalism is such a struggling business model, they need you, right? So if you are a subscriber to a newspaper or a magazine, you got to reach out to those publications when you see something right or when you see something wrong. I use an example in the book of uh, this guy named Michael Stoller, who reached out to NPR last year and was like, hey, it really annoys me when NPR uses the term mud hut. Well, the ombudsman of NPR like took his question seriously. She looked into it. They called me and some other experts in equity and language, and we were like, yeah, it's not a dignified term because the reciprocal isn't true, right? You would never refer to, a white person in a suburb in the United States based on the construction materials they used to build their house. So one of the rules that we use at Global Press is we ask the question, is the reciprocal true? And if you would not describe, sort of the reciprocal end of a description differently, then
Right.
it's not a dignified term. So NPR doesn't use the term anymore. So
Mm.
this one guy writes in and he's like, hey, this bugs me. I don't think it's dignified. I don't think it's precise. And NPR heard him and they changed.
Yeah.
I think that there are real opportunities. I I taught at Georgetown last year, and my students taught me so much in that semester. But it was also really gratifying to see them become such like hawk-eyed consumers of international news during the semester, where students that were kind of like meh on international news in September, by December, they were like, this story is bylined in New York, but it's about Nigeria. Like, how does that work? Or this story about, Democratic Republic of Congo, none of the sources live on the continent. Like there are all these ways that when we get smarter about the news that we consume, we can hold publications to account and we can let them know that we want better. And if they're not going to provide it for us, the reality is that there are places out there like Global Press and others doing extraordinary international coverage. If you care about climate journalism or criminal justice journalism, exceptional publications are out there. So if you're not getting it from your news outlet, you should let them know.
We've got 5 minutes left, and there's a couple of questions coming in from people listening. So one that builds on what you're saying right here is the person says you're working on a mindset shift about who tells the story. What are a few specific ways you'd like to see some of those bigger newsrooms like the New York Times or the Guardian set up differently in the years ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so simple, right? Historically, legacy newsrooms say, okay, like we're sending so-and-so into India or into South Africa or wherever it is. And when that foreign correspondent arrives, they instantly hire a fixer, right? A fixer is generally a local journalist, a trained professional that helps the foreigner, arranges their interviews, often even helps them write the story. That person is often never given credit, right? They're also typically underpaid and face a lot of security risks, but that's a conversation for another day. The mandate going forward is just like, don't send the first guy, elevate that fixer to the byline, right? There are so many ways that we can just make subtle shifts. I think partnership is another amazing example. I use the example in the book of our partnership with PBS NewsHour, where the PBS NewsHour audience has a high demand for international news, but PBS NewsHour is like, look, we can afford to send people to Mongolia, so we're going to partner with Global Press and we're going to bring important stories about parts of the world, whether it's Mongolia or Zimbabwe, to our audiences through partnership. So I think if legacy and larger news organizations can really open themselves up to the reality of a different storyteller and really open themselves up for partnership, we'll see a very different industry quickly.
So another question appropriate for the era we're living in. More and more newsrooms are coming up with guidelines for how to use generative AI capabilities or not. How is Global Press Newsroom approaching it?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. We're staying 9,000 miles away from it. I think human beings with proximate access, with local language skills are the key to rebuilding trust in journalism. But I do think there are opportunities for a newsroom like Global Press, other solutions and comprehensive oriented newsrooms to really like invest in and leverage AI, because we have the opportunity for these machines to help us shift narrative change, right? These AI is so informed by journalism. We need to make sure that we are feeding these machines with other things than just sort of like the typical stereotypical narratives of the world, so that AI can help us perpetuate more accurate and comprehensive narratives about our world and more dignified narratives about people everywhere.
Okay, well, one last question from me. I remember you've written about how you were interested in becoming a journalist from very early on when you were quite young. And over the last 20 years, as we've talked about just a few minutes ago, like the narrative is about an industry in crisis, right? So it's almost like stay away from this thing, right? That's like on fire. But maybe that's changing. So advice to your young self, a young Cristi today, who's thinking about wanting to tell stories, who cares about democracy, like what's the advice for young or aspiring journalists?
I would say two things. One, I would say learn how to take up space in systems that were not built for you, because we need to infiltrate these systems. And there are lots of ways to do it, right? I actually did it by giving up, passing my pen and giving up my own byline to further others. But there are a lot of ways that people can take up space in systems that were not originally created for them. So I think that would be number one. And number two, I would say, having a really strong viewpoint about what journalism means to you, and that you as a journalist have the right to safety, you have the right to good pay. Like, we can really hold news organizations accountable. I was so struck by my students at Georgetown, and not a single one of them had aspirations to work for the Post or the Times or the AP. They all wanted to work for smaller, more mission driven newsrooms. And so, I think that legacy is going to find themselves with a real talent problem in the years to come, unless we really focus on the quality employment piece. So I would say to any young journalist, advocate for your worth. And, we need to make journalism jobs better for the next generation of journalists.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Cristi. The half hour went by fast, as it always does, but we packed a lot in. Thank you those of you for listening in. We'll have a next Welcome Change next Wednesday and the following. Meanwhile, Cristi, good luck on the tour. We'll wanna get some little updates here and there. And where in the world is Cristi? Will be next.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the conversation, Michael. Good to see you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.